Hello, my name is Jackson Howard, and welcome to Proslogion Philosophy, where we provide you with the resources to think rationally about religious issues from a uniquely Christian perspective. We're so excited that you're here, and grab your favorite cup of coffee and sink in for a really cool episode. Our guest today is Dr. Liz Jackson, and I recommend that you go subscribe to her channel and check out her work, which will all be linked below. And also, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.
Hello everyone, I'm Juan, and I am the co-host of Proslogion Philosophy. I would like to say a word of prayer before our interview. O Father, most merciful, in the beginning you created us, and by the passion of your only Son you created us anew. Walk in us now, both to will and to do what pleases you, since we are weak and can do no good thing by ourselves. Grant us your grace and heavenly blessing, that in whatever walk we engage, we may do all to your honor and glory. Keep us from sin, and empower us daily to do good works, that as long as we live in the body, we may always perform service to you. After our departure, give us pardon of all our sins, and receive us to eternal life. Through him who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, forever and ever. Amen.
Dude, Juan and I'm not good with technology. I'm like awful. I'm so bad.
Same. I feel you. Yeah. It took me forever to figure out how to make a video with a PowerPoint presentation with it. So like that literally took me like a month. So don't even worry.
Juan, every time that Juan and I meet to like talk, we spent like an hour trying to figure out how to get my printer to work. It was awful.
Printers are just the worst. People need to just stop using, like, expecting us to use them. I feel like I'm very much on the like anti-printer train. We actually just bought a printer too, because I just feel like, especially the generation above us, I don't even know if I'm in you guys' generation, but older people expect us to always be able to print stuff. And I'm like, people just don't have printers, you know what I mean? So
yeah, when we were planning the meeting, we literally spent like half of it trying to figure out how the printer worked. Literally.
Printers are just get an iPad. Like, I don't know. I probably have way too strong opinions about this. But anyway.
And Liz, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us your background, some of your research interests and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. So I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. So I was there, I graduated in 2019. And then I actually did a postdoc for a year in Australia at Australian National University. So that was super fun. I basically got to just do research for a year, and I was also in Australia. So it was a cool year, although it was also weird because that was also when COVID came out and the fires. So it was kind of cut short, but it was still really fun. And then after that, I started last July. So I started July 2020 at Ryerson University, which is a university in Toronto, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy there. So it has been weird. We're actually fully remote, so I'm teaching totally online. So it's definitely been an interesting way to start a job, but it's still been really good. And just a little bit about my research interests. So my main two areas of research are in epistemology and in philosophy of religion. So in epistemology, my dissertation was on the relationship between belief and confidence, or what philosophers often call credence. So really interested in kind of questions about like what mental states do we have, and then what makes those rational. So I guess a big question I'm also interested in is just the question like, what should we believe? You know, do we always have to follow the evidence? Are there cases where things besides evidence could affect what we should believe? So those kinds of questions. And epistemology is traditionally about knowledge, but I think it's also very within the realm of epistemology to kind of ask questions about rational belief. So I focus more on rational belief than on knowledge. And then the other area that I'm really interested in is philosophy of religion. And there I would say my research interest is sort of summed up in the questions about what makes a religious commitment rational. And then you can interpret commitment as religious belief. I think belief is kind of a sort of commitment, or like a commitment to act or practice a certain religion. So I'm really interested in sort of faith. What is faith? We're going to talk about that today. How is faith different than belief? And then also, I've done quite a bit of work on Pascal's wager. It's an argument that we should believe in God because we have a lot to gain if God exists, and not much to lose if God doesn't exist. But a lot of people hate the argument. So I don't know if I've like fully defended it, but I think it's a lot more plausible than some people think. So I've been like, hey, maybe there are some responses to these objections that everyone's giving. So those are sort of my two areas of interest within philosophy of religion.
Yeah, and you kind of did you invent this new position of belief, credence, dualism? Is that your whole thing?
I didn't invent it, but I'm one of the people that I think has been pushing it and trying to make people see that it's plausible. So I would say, just like if you're interested, there's basically three main positions on the relationship between belief and credence. So there's the view that beliefs reduce to credences, that credences reduce to beliefs, or that neither reduces to the other. So this view that neither reduces to the other is the view that I'm really interested in and I've defended. But then the view, so I would say like most people, I think back in the day, or I don't know, for a long time, the popular view was that beliefs reduce to credences. So when you believe something, it's just a high credence or a high confidence that that thing is true. But I think there's actually been sort of a shift lately, and I think a lot more people have been really interested in this idea that we might actually have both beliefs and credences. I mean, it does seem we don't want to multiply entities beyond necessity, right? We don't want to posit both of these just to posit them, but if we have good reason to think we have both of them, then I think that would make sense. So I wasn't the one that invented the view, but I do think it's kind of seen a surge in popularity, which is kind of cool. And then there's this other view that I would say has always remained a little bit unpopular, which is the view that credence is just our beliefs. But some of you might know Andrew Moon. I think both of you know him. He likes and defends that view, which great for him. That's awesome. It's good that he's defending a view that not a lot of people hold. But sadly, I don't think that view has ever really enjoyed popularity. So
that's great. And today we're discussing the papers Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager and Faith, Hope, and Justification. So we kind of planned out kind of a basic structure of the interview. We're going to kind of start by defining faith, hope, and belief, which is something that you spent some time doing in the paper. And then we're going to kind of move to a summary or defense of the papers. So if you want, let's start there. Perhaps walk us a bit through how you define faith and hope in your papers, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first sort of overall distinction that I make that I think is helpful for then understanding belief, faith, and hope is the distinction between two general kinds of attitudes. This is a common thing that, philosophers of mind and epistemologists common distinction that they'll make. So the first kind of attitude is a cognitive attitude. You could also think of it as like an epistemic attitude. And these are going to be things like beliefs or credences or confidence levels, beliefs about probabilities, those kinds of things. And what all these attitudes have in common is they have what's called a mind to world direction of fit. So what that means is that when, if I see that it's raining outside, my mind conforms to the world. So I believe things when I see the world as a certain way. So my mind is the thing that's molding onto the world. And these attitudes, beliefs, credences, probability beliefs, they represent the world. So if I, believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, I'm representing the world like it's going to rain tomorrow. And these attitudes, at least when they're rational, they often track the truth, they respond to evidence, and we evaluate them from an epistemic point of view. Often, like, do you have good evidence to support that would be at least one of the big factors we would think about when evaluating these attitudes. So those are cognitive states. The other kind of attitude is conative or conative states. I actually don't know the right way to say that. I usually say conative, but I've heard other people say conative, so I'm not sure. But conative mental states would be things like desires or a belief that something is good, or like a pro attitude, like I'm for this thing, I'm on this team. And these have the opposite direction of fit. So they have a world to mind direction of fit. So if I desire to have ice cream after dinner tonight, then I can go out and get ice cream. So I make the world conform to this desire that's in my mind. So it's kind of the opposite direction of fit than the cognitive states. What's interesting about these states is they reflect what we take to be desirable or valuable, but they don't necessarily require the same level of evidence or justification. So I can, desire that the coronavirus never happened, even though I have tons of evidence that it did. I can even potentially desire something even if I know that it's false. Desire that some, past thing didn't happen that was really terrible or something like that. And I guess one thing here is like, if I believe that something is good, I need evidence that that thing is good for that belief to be justified, but I don't necessarily need evidence that that thing is true. So if I believe it would be a good thing that God existed, for example, I don't need a ton of arguments that God exists. I just need evidence that, it would be a good thing for whatever reason, if God existed. So that's kind of this background distinction that I think is really important for understanding. Did either of you want to jump in before I go into?
Just kind of one quick question that I think popped into my mind is what exactly kind of determines whether one has a positive cognitive or attitude towards something else. For example, I was reading a bit about the axiology of theism lately, and there are many arguments on both sides. So I was wondering whether you have to kind of try to assess for yourself all the arguments before you actually adopt a cognitive attitude, or is it something that you kind of believe in some kind of, I don't know, defeasible manner? You just I don't know how to pronounce that. Just believe it's true, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's a really good question. So here's like a really basic rule of thumb, and then I'll try to like answer the question more specifically. But one way you can think about it is like beliefs and maybe cognitive attitudes more generally, they aim at the truth, and then cognitive attitudes aim at the good. So that's kind of a general way to think about the distinction. Then I think your question maybe is like, well, what justifies a cognitive attitude, or what makes it rational? And I think that's a really hard question that people debate about a lot. One thing that I think is a plausible, at least first start of an answer, is if you have a lot of evidence something is good, that can justify you to desire that thing is good. And sometimes we don't, you might desire to get back with your ex who was like a terrible person or abusive or something, even though you have a lot of evidence that wouldn't be good. So that would be an irrational desire. So it's interesting actually how evidence plays a role in both cases, but in one case it's evidence that a thing is true, and in another case it's evidence that a thing is good. Then, another question is, do you have to go like read the axiology of theism literature to be justified in the belief that it would be good if God existed? The desire, or I guess that, or the desire for God to exist. And, I think this is actually in some ways parallel to the question, like, how many arguments do you have to have for God's existence to be justified in believing in God? So I personally think you could actually be rational to believe in God without a bunch of arguments for God's existence. Insofar as I believe that, I think I'm committed to some very thin version of Reformed epistemology, but I wouldn't, necessarily go all in for, there's a lot of things associated with that term, and some are much more controversial. So I think, insofar as I'm committed to that, I would probably say you don't have to know all these arguments like for and against whether it would be a good thing that God existed in order to have a justified desire for God to exist. But I think that's an interesting debate to kind of be had in its own right. And I actually don't know of any literature directly on that question. So it's really interesting.
Are you maybe more favorably disposed towards some kind of classical evidentialism?
That's a good question too. I'm not one of those like hardcore evidentialists that are just like constantly spouting evidentialism, because I do want to make space for the thought that potentially some non-evidential factors could make a difference to what I should believe, like maybe even like what possibilities I'm considering, or I'm trying to think, like I'm open to the potential idea that maybe practical or moral factors could make a difference. I mean, probably not, but I want to be open to that. So I'm not like hardcore evidentialist in the way that some people are, but I'm much more in that camp. Like I think evidence is like one of the main things that determines rationality, and then there could be these other factors that play a small role as well, but like evidence is like one of the main things. So that's basically my view.
Okay, that's great. And then in your paper, you kind of go on to define hope as opposed to faith, which are kind of related. But could you perhaps also walk us a bit through how you define faith and how that's kind of relevant to what you're arguing?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about belief as well, or just like focus more on faith and hope?
I suppose you could talk about maybe all three of the belief, hope, and faith, and kind of the interrelationships between those three.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have this distinction in the back of our minds between the cognitive and the cognitive, right? So that's going to play a role in how I define these. So belief is primarily a cognitive state, in the sense that it has a mind to world direction of fit. It's going to be responsive to evidence. It's going to be truth tracking, at least when rational. And it's hard to define exactly what a belief is, but a rough definition is you believe something when you sort of take it to be the case or regard it as true. So again, your beliefs are going to change often when your evidence changes. And belief also doesn't have implications for desire. So you believe a lot of things that you don't have a desire for them to be true, because you just have tons of evidence that they're true. I believe like I missed my flight. I believe like my internet went out, all these things, like I can believe them and it doesn't really matter if I desire them or not. Okay, so that's belief. Faith and hope are different than belief. So belief is primarily a cognitive state. And in my view, faith and hope have a cognitive element, but also have a cognitive element. And that's one reason they're different than belief. So one of the, like maybe just focusing on faith versus belief really quick, I said I believed like I missed my flight. It would be really weird to say that I had faith that I missed my flight. That doesn't really make sense, so unless I wanted to miss my flight, right? And I think that brings out the difference between faith and belief. Faith requires a desire for the statement or the proposition in question, and belief doesn't. So that's why faith has this cognitive component and belief doesn't. Another huge debate, which I'll just flag really quickly, this might come up later, is whether, so what I just said, I think shows that you can have belief without faith, because faith requires a desire and belief doesn't. The sort of opposite question is more controversial. Can you have faith without belief? Could you have faith that God exists if you don't believe that God exists is a big one. So I think in a lot of my work, I tried not to take a stand either way on that, although I think I'm sympathetic to some arguments that maybe you could have faith without belief. But I try to remain ecumenical on that. That's one of the biggest debates in the faith literature is, maybe I start off believing something and I get a bunch of evidence against it, so I can't believe it anymore, but I really want it to be true. Could I continue to have faith that it's true, even though I can't keep believing it? That's a big question. But at the very least, a lot of people think if I get way too, let's say I start off believing in God, I get some evidence against God's existence, and then maybe I have faith that God exists, but I don't believe. And then I just get like tons more evidence. So my confidence or credence is super low. I think most people would think at that point, you can't have faith anymore, or at the very least, your faith would be irrational if you think there's only like a 1% chance that God existed or something. So even if you can have faith without belief, there's a limit to, I guess, how low your credence could be. So the cognitive component of faith is at least moderately strong. You at least need a somewhat high credence. It doesn't have to be maybe super high, but at least maybe a middling credence for faith. And then hope. So hope is similar to faith. and that it has also both of these components, the cognitive and the conative. So the traditional view of hope is that hope only requires a belief that the thing in question is possible. So if I hope that it will rain tomorrow, it can be super, super likely, or let's say I hope it'll be sunny tomorrow, it can be super, super likely that it will rain tomorrow, but I can still hope that it will be sunny, as long as there's some chance it will be sunny. And then hope requires a desire. So hope again requires that conative component. So it would be silly to say, I hope it's going to rain or I hope it's going to be sunny tomorrow, but I have no desire at all for it to be sunny tomorrow. That just wouldn't really make sense. So what's interesting about hope when compared to faith is that if we lose so much evidence that we can't have faith anymore, as long as we still think there's some chance of this thing happening, or we have a credence that's slightly above zero, it seems like we can still hope for that thing. So hope, like faith, has this strong conative component. It requires this desire, but it has a very weak cognitive requirement, only that the thing in question be possible.
I was actually kind of wondering about that. Perhaps this is kind of a silly question, but I was wondering whether one does actually, I was wondering whether it's actually required to have a very weak cognitive status, because it seems to me that, I don't know, perhaps imagine if something terrible occurred to you, and for some reason, you know, it's impossible for that thing not to have happened. So it happened kind of necessarily. It still seems kind of, let's say, rational for you to say, I hope that never happened, or something like that. So it seems like one could still hope in something, even if one knows it's like the prior probability of it being true is zero, literally. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's something that came to mind while reading the paper.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I do think Andrew Chignell has brought up cases like this where he's like, I hope maybe someone could hope that they would be resurrected from the dead, even if they think that's impossible or something. So yeah, I think that's an interesting possibility. I think one move that some people make is they distinguish hoping from wishing. So you could say like, I wish that this horrible thing didn't happen, or I wish that I could be resurrected from the dead, but I think it's impossible. And so then they would say, that's really what you're doing. You're not actually hoping. But yeah, I think I would probably lean towards the view that to hope there needs to be at least some chance of it, even if it's really, 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 really small. But I'm open to the idea that maybe you could have a credence of zero in something and still hope for it. And that would be really interesting, because maybe you could hope that God exists, even if you literally think it's impossible. So in some ways, I think that would actually make some of my work more interesting if that were true. But yeah, it's a really good question.
That's actually similar to a kind of big problem you find in the literature and the axiology of theism. And it's that not everyone, but most philosophers think God is necessary. So when you're actually trying to figure out the axiological status of theism, and you want to compare, I don't know, a theistic possible world with a naturalistic possible world, and you think the theistic possible world is necessarily true, well, then you're going to think the naturalistic world is literally impossible. So it's very hard to actually compare them, if that makes sense. But it still kind of makes sense to believe it would be good if God existed, even if you're a naturalist and you think it's impossible, if you think naturalism is necessarily true or something like that. But yeah, that's something definitely very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm actually I don't talk about this very much, but I'm actually a really big fan of impossible worlds. Like, I think insofar as possible worlds are useful, impossible worlds are actually also very useful. That's a whole nother topic, and I'm not an expert on it at all, but I took a class on it and I just randomly got super passionate about impossible worlds. So I would be interested in maybe using impossible worlds to make that comparison, but it does get tricky, because you're like, does that mean if there's true and then also are contradictions true in every impossible world? That's also a question, because some people think you could have metaphysical impossibility without there being a true contradiction. But then there's a question of if we do have a true contradiction, then do we have this explosion where everything's just true? So things get complicated and formally complicated there too. But I think impossible worlds are actually a really fun and useful tool.
Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to kind of add, Jackson, before we kind of jump into the next kind of section.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, do you think that there is some kind of difference between the conative element of faith and the conative element of hope? Like, do you think that the conative element of hope must be stronger or like just more dominant, I guess?
It's a good question. I think I mentioned this in one of my papers, but it is something I hold tentatively. But in one of the papers, I suggest that if hope's conative component is stronger than faith's, this can at least kind of this can explain some things. It can do some interesting work for us. There's at least two reasons I think we might want to go in for a view where hope is generally associated with even stronger desires than faith. So the first one is, if hope has equal or weaker desires than faith and this weaker cognitive component, hope just kind of seems like this like fallback. Like, I used to have faith, then I lost too much evidence, so now I have hope. But that's like, it's really just a fallback to faith. And it's not clear like that it's doing that much interesting work in and of itself. It's just sort of like this little brother to faith if you like, did have faith, but now you just lost evidence or, whatever. And so I kind of like the idea that hope might have this like distinct power kind of above and beyond faiths. And one way you could, get that going is if hope is associated with stronger desires than faith is. And I mean, there's something natural about that too. Like, we use hope and desire interchangeably, at least in a lot of cases. If you say, I hope for something, I desire for something, I mean, hope just seems so distinctively tied up with desire. So I think it's natural in just the way like we use the word hope as well. So that's one reason. And then the other reason was, there's this puzzle that people in the hope literature talk about quite a bit, which is like, how can hope have so much power in helping us persevere through really, really tough situations? Like, think about, surviving cancer or surviving a concentration camp. And hope, arguably in some cases, has kept people going through things like that. When all it is like a desire that you survive, and then like this, you're thinking like, there's some chance I survive. Like, can that really like have this motivating power? It's just this small possibility plus this desire. And so the thought is, I mean, maybe this won't totally explain it, but if hope is associated with like these extra strong desires, that can at least go part of the way to explaining why hope is so motivating, because that outcome of surviving or, whatever would be that good that it can kind of explain why hope does have this special motivating force. So those were sort of some tentative suggestions for maybe hope has an even stronger conative component than faith. But I actually had, in one of the papers, I had some referees that really didn't like that. So, I hold it tentatively, but I do think there's some plausibility behind it.
Okay, that's great. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, Jackson. I think
No, that was a really good answer. I'm really satisfied with
that. Another thing I had kind of planned was kind of a quick summary, if you don't mind, of the papers we're discussing. I mainly kind of focused on the paper on faithfully taking Pascal's wager. I wrote so many notes on that. So perhaps you could also kind of walk us a bit through those papers and what you try to argue in them.
So it was that one and then the faith, hope, justification paper?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. Do you want me to start with one or the other, or just whatever?
Oh, yeah, it doesn't matter. Don't worry.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about both, but then you should feel free to like ask follow-ups or ask me to expand on stuff. So yeah, like the two papers. So the first is faith, hope, and justification. It's not the best title, but it's fine. So what I do in that paper is at the beginning, I actually kind of talk about a lot of the things that we've just covered, which is sort of what are faith and hope, and then how they have these conative and cognitive components. And then one thing I suggest that we didn't talk about explicitly is this idea that some mental states are, in some sense, fundamental. And that means like they don't reduce to other mental states. So some people think like belief is fundamental. I think that's a common view. Belief just isn't made up of other mental states, but it's kind of its own mental state. And then some people think desire is fundamental. Some people think that desire is just our beliefs about goodness. So that's kind of a weird view, but that is a view people have. And then, maybe there's like emotions, maybe there's imaginings, or maybe those reduced to other states. There's a lot of debates that happen here about which mental states are fundamental and then which mental states can reduce to others. And actually, that's basically what my dissertation was about, trying to argue we shouldn't reduce credence to belief or belief to credence, but they're both fundamental. So one thing that I think that I talk about in this paper is I actually don't think that faith and hope are fundamental mental states in this sense, because I think they're often made up of some kind of cognitive state and then some kind of conative state. So a belief in a desire maybe, or a 0.5 credence in a desire, or a 0.1 credence in a pro attitude, or whatever. And so that's something that I point out in this paper. And I think that's why it can actually be a little more complex to ask questions about what would make them rational, because if there's these two components to faith and hope, one has a world to mind direction of fit, one has a mind to world direction of fit. And so they kind of have opposite directions of fit. And so things do get a little more complex here, but I think actually in an interesting way. And then, I guess one more thing I wanted to add first too is just because a state isn't like a fundamental mental state doesn't mean like it's not important or not valuable or not worth studying. And in fact, I actually think because faith and hope have both cognitive and conative components, they can motivate us to act and justify action in a way that a lot of states that only have one component or the other can't. So I think there's actually something powerful and interesting about the fact that they have both these components, and it's not like, oh, they're non-fundamental, so like they're boring, let's just study the fundamental ones. That's not my view at all. I think faith and hope are really interesting and cool. So then I guess what I go on to suggest in this paper, another really interesting thing about faith and hope, like when we're talking about what justifies them in contrast with belief, is that, most people think when we think about beliefs, we should evaluate them epistemically. So we should ask questions like, are they supported by evidence? Do they amount to knowledge? Are they formed reliably? But we're really looking at them mainly from an epistemic point of view. So we have epistemic rationality, which is kind of what I was just talking about. Does it amount to knowledge? Is it supported by your evidence? Is it not formed on the basis of wishful thinking or hasty generalizations? That's kind of epistemic rationality. There's this other thing, which is practical rationality, which is basically like, is it conducive to your flourishing, or does it coincide with what your goals are? Is it good for you? Is another way of thinking about it, right? And so there's a big debate, but a lot of people think that we can't even evaluate beliefs practically. I think that's too strong for sure, but they say like we don't even have practical reasons for and against belief, because beliefs are these things that aim at the truth. They seek, a belief is good when it's true, so we should just evaluate it epistemically. I think that's too strong. I think we can evaluate beliefs practically. But this is getting a little long-winded, but the reason I think it's interesting is because when it comes to faith and hope, people evaluate them practically all the time without even thinking, like second guessing it. It's a super common thing. And then like some people have come in and been like, oh, can we also evaluate hope epistemically? That's kind of interesting. Let's think about that. You know what I mean? So the literature has gone very differently in the case of faith and hope than it's gone with belief in terms of questions about justification. And so I think that's really interesting. I think it's much more clear to people that faith and hope can be evaluated practically and maybe also epistemically, especially faith, than belief. And so what I sort of ultimately suggest in this paper is that the practical rationality of faith or hope, which again is this thing that aims at kind of your goals or what's good for you, that's going to be in some way associated with the conative component. And then the epistemic rationality of faith and hope is going to be associated with the cognitive component of faith and hope. So, Juan, you had some interesting pushback on this, but let's just say that it's irrational to hope something if you have a credence of 0 in it. We could evaluate epistemically because it involves the credence involved in hope. But if it's like the case we were talking about before, like hoping to get back together with your ex, then we can say that's practically irrational because it's not good for you. So that's sort of the first paper. Do you want to talk about that at all before I move to the one on Pascal's wager, or?
Did we talk about propositional and doxastic justification at all?
No, I didn't
No, we
mention
haven't
that
talked about
actually,
that.
but I'm happy to.
Sure, then let's, because I think maybe to get like a fuller picture of,
Yeah.
well, let me ask this first. Do you think that the distinction between propositional and doxastic justification makes a difference when we get to Pascal's wager?
I don't think so because, yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting and it's an important distinction, but part of the reason I talked about that is partially just because that was the topic of the volume that this paper is going to be included in. So I wanted to, focus on that as part of the theme of what all the other papers were talking about. So I do think it's interesting, but I don't think it's directly relevant for the next paper.
Okay, then let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, sounds good. So want me to I'll summarize the other paper and then we can talk about it a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, I have more thoughts on that one, so yeah, we can go ahead.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm just getting a drink. Okay. So the other paper, it's called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager. And in this paper, what I basically try to argue is, okay, so let me just say briefly what Pascal's wager is. It's this argument that you should believe in God because you have a lot to gain if you believe in God and God exists. Maybe you would go to heaven or have this relationship with God. And there's some axiology of theism stuff actually behind this, which is interesting. And I'd like to think more about in future papers, but haven't thought as much about as I want to. And then the thought is, if you believe in God, let's just start with a possibility that God exists. You believe in God, it's really good. You don't believe in God, maybe you're annihilated, maybe you go to hell. Either way, it's a lot worse than if you believed in God. And then if God doesn't exist, it doesn't really matter what you do either way. Maybe that's too strong, but either way, it's finite. So the thought is that the infinite goods that you could get if God exists trump the finite gains or losses there would be if God doesn't exist. That's a super basic version, and I just say that so people that aren't familiar have background, but I will say that my version of the wager, and actually even Pascal's himself, they're almost all much more complex than that. I think most people don't think that super basic version of the wager is going to work for various reasons. But that's sort of the basic, concept of Pascal's wager. So what I try to do in this paper, one reason that Pascal's wager gets criticized, especially from Christians, is that these are just bad motives. People that take the wager, it seems like they're just being motivated like for selfish reasons, or they just want to avoid hell, or they don't really care about God or who God is. They just want to, it just seems like they're just trying to take a bet, which I don't really see what's wrong with taking a bet, but people will say that, like, it's not gambling. Like they'll say it's not gambling, so some Christians complain they just don't like the motives associated with Pascal's wager. And so what I try to do in this paper is sort of carve out a way to take Pascal's wager that I think doesn't exemplify bad motives. So the point isn't to say that every way of taking Pascal's wager automatically means you have good motives. That's too strong, and I think that just isn't true. But it's to say that there's a way of taking Pascal's wager that does exemplify good motives that God would be pleased with, and in fact actually looks quite a bit like recent accounts of what it is to have faith that God exists. And then I argue that even if these people don't exemplify faith that God exists, they can exemplify hope that God exists. And then I talk about some reasons why I think that might be significant as well. So I guess one thing I do want to say too is when I'm talking about taking the wager, I want to focus on this really specific case of someone that is motivated by the goodness of committing to God, given the possibility that God exists. So they're really focused on, if I commit to God and God exists, that would be a really good thing, to have a relationship with this all good, all powerful being who created me and cares about me. So that's kind of the main thing that's driving them and motivating them. And I think being motivated to pursue God for that kind of reason can actually reflect the cognitive and conative attitudes that we were just talking about. So then I go into that in a little more detail, and then I say, if your credence that God exists is super, super low, but you still decide to take the wager because you think there's some chance that God exists, but it's maybe very unlikely, maybe your credence or your confidence level is too low for you to have faith, or at least rationally have faith, right? So then I say that would be a case where you would hope that God exists, and you could demonstrate this other theological virtue. So I think it's kind of cool, they say faith, hope, and love. So, we aren't talking about love, but we're talking about those first two. So that's a basic summary.
Yeah, so I have so many notes, I don't know where to start. But one question that I really had is that at one point in the paper, you say, recently some have argued that rational belief is consistent with credences below 0.5. I was wondering, perhaps this is kind of a very hard question, but I was wondering, at what point do you think it becomes rational belief becomes irrational? At what point do your credences are just so low that they are not rational anymore?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think there's two ways of going. Okay, so maybe I'll say this. My dissertation was about belief credence dualism. That is just a descriptive claim that just says beliefs and credences both exist. So I just want to clarify that's different than the question we're talking about now. The question we're talking about now is, what's the relationship between beliefs and credences when they're rational? And so, this isn't, dualism is this descriptive thing. So this is like a whole nother thing. And if you could rationally believe something but have a really low credence in that, dualism doesn't automatically imply that that's possible. So I just want to say that, so to clarify things for people. But what is interesting and related to this is this thesis. It's called the Lockean thesis. And the Lockean thesis says that when you rationally believe P, you have a rational credence in P that's above some threshold. And then you can debate about what that threshold is. Some people have actually said the threshold is 1, which I just think that can't be right for a number of reasons, but that people have suggested that. One nice thing about that is it doesn't look ad hoc. So if you say the threshold is 0.863, it's like, why? Like, why is it there? So 1 is this nice, clean, simple view, but, we're more confident in some of our beliefs than others. There's lots of things I rationally believe that I'm not 100% certain of. And the people, they have ways around these worries, but I don't think they're convincing. So what you can do if you think 1 is too high, you can say like the threshold varies in different contexts, maybe depending on what's at stake, maybe depending on what possibilities are salient, the threshold could go up and down. Or you could set a threshold, like some people have set it at 0.5. That also doesn't seem super ad hoc. Or you could set it even lower than 0.5, maybe in certain cases. So I do think my view is ultimately consistent with a Lockean view that has the threshold pretty low, like 0.4, 0.3, something like that. So then what it would say is, if your credence gets that low, you really need to give up your belief. But I don't have a firm view on like, this is where the exact threshold would be, or I might say the threshold would vary with context. So that's kind of one family of views. The other family of views that I probably lean more towards this camp. The reason I mention the Lockean stuff is because I don't want to just like rule that out completely, but I think this is the kind of view that I like better. So what it says is that actually rational belief and rational credence are even more independent of each other. So there's certain kinds of evidence that can move our credences around quite a bit, but not change what we believe. And if we get the right kind of evidence against some proposition that just moves our credences, there's actually no, like, at least in principle, lower limit. It's just once we get a certain kind of evidence, then we should give up our belief. And I don't want to go into this too much, but the reason that people are tempted by this view, I think, is because it does seem like certain things like statistical evidence should move our credences around quite a bit without changing what we should believe. Here's an example that is really common in the literature. This is one that Laura Bouchat gives. So she's like, I left my cell phone on the table. I come back and it's stolen. And the only 2 people in the room were John and Barbara. So one of them had to have taken it. And let's just say men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women, which is a made up statistic. But let's just say you should have like a 0.91 credence that John stole it. So that statistical evidence moves your credence up quite a bit, but you shouldn't believe John stole it. And you could even imagine a statistic that moves it up to like 0.99 or something. But that doesn't give you a reason to believe that John stole it. But then it's really interesting if someone comes in and testifies, I saw John steal it, then it seems like you can believe that John stole it, even if they're not like 100% reliable. You know, eyewitnesses aren't 100% reliable. There's evidence that shows that people misremember things and all of that. So it seems like belief isn't potentially, I don't want to commit to this, more just give a survey of the views, but rational belief isn't just determined by what credence you have, it's determined by something else. And maybe statistical evidence doesn't affect rational belief as much, but testimonial evidence does. So belief might be only sensitive to certain kinds of evidence, but credences are sensitive to all these additional kinds of evidence too. So your credence can like go up and down and go all around, but then when you give up your belief, that's because you get a certain kind of evidence against it, or a certain kind of evidence for it when you would form a belief.
Do you think like the Lockean threshold you were talking about is almost like ambiguous? I remember reading Peter Van Inwagen talk about the problem of evil and talking about ambiguity. He gave the example of, he asked, how many raindrops do you need in France for France to be a fertile country? How many raindrops do you need to know have fallen in France to know that France is fertile? Any number you pick is going to seem just completely arbitrary. But there is definitely kind of a threshold. Do you think it's kind of similar where the threshold for rational belief is almost ambiguous and it's really not possible to locate it in one spot?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's some vagueness concerns in the background too. Like if I have, let's say the threshold is 0.75 and I have a 0.74 credence, and then I get a tiny bit of evidence and it's like, then I can rationally believe because I don't know. And then it's like, I don't know. It does seem kind of fishy. Ernie Souza actually has a chapter of a book where he pushes this objection against the Lockean thesis. And there's actually another philosopher who argues that the threshold is like vague, or it's kind of it's like a fuzzy threshold. So it's not like this exact number, but it's kind of like maybe it's over an interval, or it's kind of like this fuzzy thing. And so Matthew Lee is his name. He also actually went to Notre Dame. So there's different ways of getting around it. That would be one way to go, is to kind of have like a fuzzy threshold, or try to draw the line at a place that doesn't look ad hoc. But I still think it's weird that you can't believe, and then you get this tiny bit of evidence that moves your credence, and then you can, you know? So it does seem like a potential problem.
Okay, I don't know if Jackson, you had any other thoughts before I kind of continue.
Yeah, that was really good. It seems like there could be some maybe objections that one kind of bring us back to the wager. It seems like there could be some objections to like basic assumptions that are made within the wager, such as like it seems to assume something like eternal conscious torment and not universalism. And it seems to assume that, I mean, obviously that God existing would be a good thing. And so maybe the evil God problem could be another really big objection to taking Pascal's wager. In that, like, if someone was a universalist, then they wouldn't necessarily be motivated to take the wager in the same way that someone who was an eternal conscious or believed in eternal conscious torment would be motivated to take the wager, and someone who believed that God existing would be not a good thing, then they obviously would not be motivated to believe in God.
Yeah, those are great objections. So yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you just said, but a couple things to clarify, I guess. So one thing is, you know, I think you would still be very motivated to take the wager I think if you were an annihilationist, assuming heaven is a good thing and annihilationism is like 0 or something. So at least for me, I would rather continue to live on in a good life than cease to exist. So I think annihilationists, have no problem explaining the wager. But I think one thing that's really interesting about Pascal's wager is the way that it does kind of rely on probabilities. And so the thought is, if you're a universalist and you think everyone goes to heaven, you can still actually get the wager off the ground as long as you don't have a credence of 1 in universalism. So if you think there's some chance that either people are annihilated or there is eternal conscious torment, you don't even have to think both, you don't have to believe in hell. You could even think if there's some chance that people are just annihilated, you can still get the wager off the ground because it's relying on this idea that even if there's a really small probability, there's this outcome that is so good. And so the risk reward trade-off, it still works out because of the risk, even if it's a small probability. So the infinite versus finite versions of the wager are going to look slightly differently here. So in the versions of the wager where they don't assign heaven and hell infinite values, they assign them like large finite values. The probability is going to matter. The probability that if you're a universalist and you think it's 0.99 likely versus just 0.9 or something, that could affect whether you should wager in the finite versions. But thankfully, I like the infinite version, so that's not a problem for me. But no, I think that's a good question and something worth thinking about more is the relationship between the wager and even the possibility of hell. Maybe that makes people uncomfortable, and there has been people that have pushed me back on this. But I do think even if you're really convinced of universalism, it's at least possible, So that's kind of where I fall on that. The evil God thing, that's super interesting. I don't actually know if I have a great answer for that. I have talked to philosophers that are like, come on, axiology of theism, like it's clearly better if God exists, but it's not a literature. It's a literature I want to get into. It's not a literature that I'm steeped in right now. I haven't read a ton of the stuff. One of my colleagues at Ryerson, Klaas Cray, he's actually one of the big people writing in that. So I should talk to him more about that. But yeah, I do think the evil God thing would be a big challenge. And I think I was kind of assuming like a pro-theist position in the background of this paper. So I totally agree with you. Maybe that's just kind of something I need to assume for this paper. But I think I want to work on that question in the future and think more about ways you might justify that. And another thing I'm really interested in is like, the pro-theism, anti-theism debate from like an epistemic point of view. So like epistemically, should we want God to exist? Because maybe if God exists and we go to heaven, we could like ask God any question and get all this like cool knowledge and interesting understanding and true belief. And so one thing I've thought about is maybe writing a paper on like the epistemic axiology of theism. But admittedly, again, I'm not at all an expert on that literature. So it's something I want to learn more about.
Something that I've kind of wondered about, which is related to Jackson's question, is that there appears, I think you probably know much more about this than I do, but there appears to be some evidence that religious people are happier and healthier. I don't know how strong it is, but there appears to be evidence on that side. I wonder whether someone who thinks universalism is true might still take the wager because they believe it's just more beneficial to be religious in the earth, regardless of whether hell exists or whether universalism is true. I don't know how the mathematics part of it kind of works out in that kind of argument, but I don't know if you have kind of any interesting thoughts on that one.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And one thing that's really interesting about this, so I guess first of all to say, you're right that there's a really big empirical question here. Are religious people in fact healthier and happier and less likely to get divorced and all of that? There is some tentative research suggesting yes, but I don't think it's strong enough that we can say definitely for sure they are. But I think if that research ends up showing that they are, one thing that's really interesting is when I was kind of presenting the original wager, I was like, well, if God exists, it's way better to believe in God. If God doesn't exist, it's like kind of finite either way, but what we could actually say is, well, look, if this evidence does support the idea that it's better to believe in God no matter what, then we can actually get this thing going that's called dominance. And what it means is that when you look at all the possible ways the world could turn out, one action is better in all those ways. And then there's another version that says it's either better or equally as good. But I think this version would be the one it's called strong dominance. So it's better no matter how the world turns out. So if God exists, I believe in God, it's better because I go to heaven. If God doesn't exist and I believe in God, it's better because I get all these earthly benefits. Even if, yeah, so the thought is like, then you won't have to worry about these complications with infinites trumping finites, and some of that can get messy. You could just have this really straight up dominance argument, and I think that's a really interesting suggestion. Again, it relies on this strong empirical principle that I think is we're still need to do a lot more research on, but I think that's a potentially really interesting version of the wager.
No, I think that's great. One question that I definitely had, and I think I had asked you this before, but it would be kind of really interesting to get your answer personally, is that I don't know if you're kind of familiar with the concept of unpossessed evidence, which is basically evidence or counter evidence against your worldview that you don't currently possess. So I don't know, perhaps you went to a library and you saw a bunch of books arguing against a specific part of your worldview, but you haven't read them. Perhaps you could use that because you don't have the time, something like that. I was wondering, what is the role that unpossessed evidence might play in Pascal's wager, and well, in the credences Christians might have about their beliefs? Do you think they should worry about them, or how should you kind of manage that? I've become quite famous because in my philosophy circle of friends, because I always asked about blogs and articles and websites and things like that, because they are kind of pieces of unpossessed evidence. So I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's definitely a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question too. So one principle that people talk about that is controversial, but I think somewhat plausible, is evidence of evidence is evidence. So the thought there is, if I know that some expert has made a really, really, really good argument for the truth of P, even though I don't know what that argument is, that at least gives me some evidence that P is true. So I don't necessarily have to go and directly become aware of the argument myself. I mean, maybe that's a good thing to do, and maybe I should do that eventually. But when I just hear about this argument, that at least gives me some evidence. So unpossessed evidence is an interesting concept. I mean, you could have unpossessed evidence that you don't know what it would support either way. So that's a trickier case. But if you have unpossessed evidence that you know supports some conclusion, I think at least some epistemologists would say you can actually be rational to alter your credences in light of that, even if you don't, in some sense, more directly possess the evidence. So I think that's one thing that's worth mentioning, the idea that evidence of evidence is evidence. But the other thing that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to questions about theism and Christianity specifically is that there's just a lot of unpossessed evidence on both sides. So there's a lot of evidence that, arguments for atheism, arguments against Christianity, smart people that believe that. I just learned actually this week, because Cam did this live stream of like 100 arguments that God exists. And then Felipe Leon has 100 arguments for atheism on his blog, which I actually didn't know about until this week. So I'm sure most of us haven't gone and like studied every single one of those, you know what I mean? So there's, arguments on this side, but it's also probably a bunch of arguments for theism and for Christianity and Christian thinkers that we either haven't heard of or haven't read, or arguments they've made that we're not aware of as well. And I think this is one of those areas where there's like just a lot of disagreement and a lot of smart people on both sides. And not every question's like that. Like whether the earth is flat is arguably not like that. There's a lot of evidence on one side and then a small number of people that deny that, right? But I think this is different than that. This is like, really, there's good arguments on both sides. There's real genuine thinkers, giving arguments for both points of view, and sometimes even Christians saying, here's an interesting argument for atheism, or vice versa. I think that's actually really cool when people do that. And so I think when it comes to theism, I don't think that unpossessed evidence should necessarily move us either way, just because it seems like there's unpossessed evidence in both directions, and it kind of weighs out against each other. And of course, it might depend on the specific case and what the specific unpossessed evidence is. So maybe in certain contexts, it would weigh one way or the other. But I think in general, a lot of times they're going to kind of cancel each other out.
Yeah, something that people have told me, which I think is interesting, is that it, like you said, it kind of depends on the case. Like, for example, if you're an atheist and you come across a creationist website that argues for Christianity, I don't think you're going to think that unpossessed evidence is really devastating.
Yeah.
Or if, for example, another stupid example is if you're a Christian and you go to an atheist website and you see several banners like advertisement for other atheist websites, I think it's unlikely that you will definitely find defeaters in places that are not peer-reviewed or things like that. So you might just want to kind of check each case individually to actually know whether what's the significance of the unpossessed evidence.
Yeah. One interesting thing about the internet is that anyone can post anything, and in some ways that's cool and that's good, and it's nice that it gives people a voice that might not have had a voice before. But I think it also just means there's a lot of information out there, and some of it's great and some of it's maybe not so great. So it does take some discernment to figure out what's worth reading and what's worth not. But I do think, especially on this question, peer reviewed is a good marker of something that's worth spending a lot of time on.
Okay. I don't know if you had any thoughts on this, Jackson, or any questions.
Yeah, that was really good. I don't know that I have any more thoughts on that. But going, there was one point near the end of your paper where you started talking about hope as more of like a theological virtue, because we've been talking about it a lot within philosophy and within like how do we define using these different more fundamental states. But it seems like when we get more into theology, someone like William Lane Craig or something is probably going to disagree with your definition of faith. So how would you maybe apply this definition when we get to more theological topics, and when we try to apply this definition as a virtue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one thing that William Lane Craig is working on right now is the relationship between faith and belief, but this applies to hope as well. And he thinks it's very clear in the Bible that you need to believe. That is one of the requirements to be a Christian or to be saved. So he's very convinced by that, and he thinks that's what the scripture supports. And I think he has some interesting arguments. He's actually changed my credences from reading some of his arguments. So I'm not saying, I'm dismissing them or anything like that. I think at the same time, there's been a number of arguments, people going through the scriptures and making the opposite point and saying, no, there's cases where these people having very serious doubts, the kind that seem to threaten their ability to believe, but they still choose to follow Jesus and risk things on Jesus. And it still seems like they have a legitimate Christian commitment. So there's a debate to be had there for sure. And one thing I actually tried to do in the Pascal's Wager paper is try to not make the whole argument of the paper hang on that debate. And that's because you can actually take Pascal's Wager as a motive to just directly believe in God. And I'll note too, believing that God exists is consistent with hoping that God exists, in the same way that it's consistent with having faith that God exists. So one thing is, if you're just really convinced by Bill's arguments, you could just say the wagerer both believes and hopes, so that's kind of one way to go, where I think this is sort of ecumenical on that. And if you really think belief is this requirement for salvation, You can just have the wagerer believe and hope, and their belief is motivated by these Pascalian reasons. So I'm very open to that. I think that's definitely a possibility. But then I guess I also want to, there's some worries for that view as well. And I have another paper where I actually argue against those worries, but everyone might not be convinced by that, but it's like, can we really just believe something because it would be good for us? Do we have that kind of control? And even if we do, would that belief be rational in the right kind of way? So because of these worries, I also am interested in what I call the acceptance version of Pascal's wager. That's a version of the wager where the wagerer doesn't directly believe, but they act as if God exists. So they go to church, they read the Bible, they commit to God's existing. When you accept that something's true, you act as if it's true. And so the belief acceptance distinction is super important, because we can be rational to accept a lot of things that it's not rational for us to believe. One example I've given before is, if your brother goes missing and he's like your best friend, and you really, really, really hope he's still alive, and maybe there's search parties for a while, but people start to give up and say, I think he's dead. I think it can be rational for you, at least to a certain point, to continue to accept that he's still alive and continue to act as if he's still alive and search for him and spend a lot of time putting up missing posters and all of that, even if it's not rational for you to believe that he's still alive. And that's because how much you have to gain, and maybe you're losing some time and effort, but ultimately it's totally worth it because of how good it would be if you found him. And so I think in the same way, it could be rational for someone to accept that God exists, and maybe underlying that would be this hope that God exists, even if they aren't rational to believe that God exists. And I think that does open up this big question, like, could that kind of person ever be saved? And in some ways, I think that question, it's not something I spend like a ton of time on in the paper, but I give some reasons to think at least that kind of posture raises the probability you'll be saved by quite a bit, as opposed to someone who just ignores everything and goes along living the life before that has nothing to do with God. So I at least think it's more likely you'll be saved. And I'm not convinced that belief is a requirement for salvation in general. I think children that die before they can form the belief that God exists or understand what that would mean can be saved. People that have never heard of the gospel can be saved. So I don't think that belief is strictly a requirement for salvation across the board either. So that's, I think, worth noting. And then I think the final thing that's worth noting too is that when you sort of engage in this hopeful acceptance of God's existence, or hopeful acceptance that Christianity is true, I think you can put yourself in a position that makes it much more likely that you'll eventually come to believe in God. Maybe you can't guarantee it, but I think you're going to be engaging in actions and engaging in practices that make it much more likely you'll like have a religious experience, or come to see that, have that inner witness of the Holy Spirit that makes you perceive God and then believe in God. So those are some kind of preliminary thoughts, but maybe that's not totally satisfying.
I think it is definitely satisfying. Those are very good answers. Just one last quick question I had, which I've always found interesting since I've started kind of digging into Pascal's wager, is whether one could actually potentially wager for different theological traditions. So, for example, imagine Jackson is a Protestant, but imagine he hopes Catholicism is true. And imagine he doesn't have much confidence that Catholicism is true, but he thinks it would be better if it were true. Do you think he could kind of apply Pascal's wager and become a Catholic? Do you think that seems kind of interesting, but I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. And I guess what you would need to think about is like, what benefits would there be in wagering for Catholicism if it were true? And I guess arguably there would be some benefits, because so I guess one thing to say is like the ultimate benefit of like going to heaven and achieving union with God, I think Catholics think that other Christians can have that as well. So that might not be there, but you could have like lesser wagers where like you could take communion in the way that God intended, or be a part of the one true church, that kind of thing. So I'm open to the idea that I don't think it might not have like the finite infinite trade-off going on just because Catholics do believe other Christians are saved. So it wouldn't be like a salvation issue, but there could be good things to gain if you wager on Catholicism and it is true. So that's a really interesting suggestion, and something that's interesting for me personally, partially just because I do think Catholicism is really interesting, but I have these kind of epistemic objections to it, like the sinlessness of Mary, certain doctrines like that. But that's an interesting thought. Like if I wanted Catholicism to be true, maybe it would be rational for me to practice it, even in spite of these big epistemic objections. So I like that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Liz. I definitely really enjoyed this. I don't know if you have any other kind of closing thoughts, Jackson, before, or any questions.
Yeah, that was a really, really insightful interview, Liz. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And it actually, I've used, or I've in discussion with some of my friends who are agnostics or atheists, I have employed kind of your version of the wager before. And one of the main objections that I've gotten almost immediately is like, well, this seems inconsistent with the Christian worldview. Like these don't seem, it doesn't seem to be motivated by reasons which are consistent with having faith and having hope. And so I love this paper, and I'm so glad that you decided to write it and publish it. And so I hope to see you in Houston in a few months so we can ball out or whatever.
Yeah, everyone going to Cam's conference. We're gonna be playing basketball, so you guys should all join us. But yeah, no, I'm super excited for that too. And I just also wanted to say before we close, thanks so much for like taking the time to read my papers and preparing questions like that. That just really means a lot. And you know, it's really kind of you both to give me your time. So thank you.
Oh no, yeah, definitely thank you for coming here. It's been so great, so amazing. So thank you very much. And we should definitely do this again if we can someday with a different paper. But yeah, it's been really great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks again.